Hello again. I'm thrilled to be here with you again and to talk a little bit more about the Gospel of John and to get a little bit more into a bit of a theological and historical understanding of the Gospel. First, I think we can talk a little bit about the place and date and authorship of the Gospel. Now, the Gospel has traditionally been attributed to John, son of Zebedee, and scholars traditionally have believed that it was written in Ephesus sometime around the end of the 1st century. And while that's fine, recent scholars, really in the past few decades, have begun to talk more about a Johannine school. And Johannine really is a fancy word meaning anything John, anything associated with John. That there was a group of people who was working together and they were writing this gospel basically more or less as a committee, right? That you had a community that they were addressing, and you had several scribes together who were working together on this text. Now, why do scholars believe that? It's pretty evident if you do a close reading of the text that there probably were some revisions. And so there are some early, what seem to be portions of the gospel that would be attributable to an early group, and portions of the gospel that seem to be attributed to a much later period of time with a much more developed theology. In fact, one of my Greek professors in seminary and graduate school talked about the possibility of John, portions of John, dating back pre-70, so being dated to 40 or 50 even, and there's no reason that you couldn't date portions of John back to 40 or 50, but there certainly seems to be a reason to date portions of it to much later. There seems to be a much more developed theology as the text goes along. Now, whoever this group was that was writing the Gospel of John also probably was responsible for the Johannine letters, so 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John. And where do we see these evidence of revisions? Well, if you look throughout the text, you have portions where it seems like things get mixed up and messed up, and you have seams and pieces of text that seems to have been stitched together. It doesn't follow in terms of a coherent narrative. It jumps back and forth, and it's more logically oriented or logically put together, but the narrative skips back and forth in terms of where it is geography. So at one point Jesus will be in Nazareth, and then he'll be in Jerusalem, and then he'll be back in Nazareth or in Galilee. He'll be going around. So he's all over the place, and it keeps going all over the place. Whoever it was, whatever group that was responsible for John, seemed to have some knowledge of Judaism of the 1st century in Palestine. So probably might have been someone who could have been a follower of Jesus or who had grown up in Palestine in that area. And if portions of John date to 40, that's certainly possible. John knows more about Palestinian geography and the Jewish festivals and practices that were practiced during Jesus' lifetime than any of the synoptic gospels. And so he really seems to be very knowledgeable about Judaism, and he knows a lot about wisdom literature. There are portions of this text that are deeply endowed with Jewish wisdom. And so we have probably someone who grew up in Judaism. And that's really kind of the struggle with this gospel, because as I was referring to in the dualism, there is really kind of an anti-Jewish kind of perspective that scholars have talked about. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in terms of the history and its development and what that looks like. Now, it's very different from the synoptics. We've been looking at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and we see that there are vast similarities between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and the four-source hypothesis explains those similarities in terms of probably Matthew and Luke using Mark as their narrative guide as they put together their text for Jesus' life and their Gospels. Now, in John, we see very contrasting content and motifs. Unlike the synoptics, John has no birth narratives. Of course, Mark doesn't have birth narratives either, but Matthew and Luke both do. There is no record of Jesus' baptism. And notice that Matthew, Mark, and Luke all start with Jesus' baptism. There's no temptation story in John. In John, Jesus does not engage in a single exorcism. There's no story of conflict between Jesus and his family. So you've got these evidence of these, no temptation, no exorcisms, no conflicts. In reality, Jesus is Lord in John. And so in John, the author of John, doesn't want Jesus to be shaded in any way with darkness, right? We see this dualism that we talked about. He doesn't want Jesus associated with darkness at all. There's no parables in John. Jesus is folksy in the Synoptics. He really tells these great stories. In John, when Jesus is talking, he's just he's like a philosopher. You have to really pay attention to what he's saying, and he gets deeper and deeper, and it's all very symbolic and full of double meaning. Not so in the Synoptics. Really, in the Synoptics, Jesus is very much down to earth. In John, we have what is called a realized eschatology. It's the sense that, or realizing eschatology, it's the sense that the audience that the gospel writer is addressing are already living in the end times. In fact, they're already living together with the Paraclete whom Jesus sent, together with the Lord, right? There's almost a sense in which the revelation has already occurred in John. And that's very different from the Synoptics, where the eschatology, there's always this now but not yet issue of eschatology. This end times vision of the Synoptics is Jesus is still coming. You better be awake. You better be aware. You better be awake. You better be ready. In John, the community is just living with Christ, present with them, or at least with the Holy Spirit, the Paraclete together with them. In John, we have a foot washing, not a communion, at the end, the Last Supper with them, but there's no words of communion. And John's glorification on the cross is really distinctly different than the Synoptics. In the Synoptics, really in Mark and Matthew and Luke, Jesus is derided by all. It's really almost like a defeat. But John goes out of his way to show that Jesus' cross, as horrifying as it must have been really a victory for his community, and a glorification. It's when Jesus comes into his own. It's when he's revealed as the Christ. It's very powerful in John. Now, also, other differences with the Synoptics. There are differences in chronology and the order of events. Jesus travels back and forth between Galilee and Jerusalem in John. Goes back and forth multiple times. In the Synoptics, it's just one direct path. Jesus is in Galilee. He's going to Jerusalem. He heads up to Jerusalem. He's crucified and resurrected. That's it, right? It's just one single arrow direction towards Jerusalem from Galilee. But in John, he's back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Because the Synoptics end up with Jesus in Jerusalem, the cleansing of the temple is at the end of Jesus' life, right? It's the beginning of the Passion Week, but it's at the end of Jesus' life, right? With John, the cleansing of the temple is the first thing that happens. Boom, right? It's sort of the big entree for Jesus. Shows that Jesus is, got this dualism. He's attacking the world. He's attacking the enemies of the gospel already at the very beginning. In the Synoptics, Jesus and John the Baptist are sort of held apart, but in John their ministry overlaps. John refers to 3 Passovers. Jesus celebrating 3 Passovers with his disciples. That means that John is covering a 3 to 4 year time span of ministry, whereas the Synoptics focus just on 1 year. Right, so John has a longer timetable for Jesus's work, and then finally, when he gathers his apostles together for the foot washing, for the Last Supper, it occurs the evening before Passover, so that Jesus might be crucified as the Passover lambs are slaughtered. There's a symbolic element to Jesus being crucified as the Passover lamb. In fact, the beginning of the gospel begins with Jesus being recognized as the Lamb who has come to take away the sins of the world. And then in the end, he's crucified at the same time as the Passover lambs. It's a narrative theme in John that's very important. In the Gospels, the Passover is what Jesus is celebrating together with his disciples for the Last Supper. And so there is a difference in terms of when Jesus celebrates this last evening with his disciples and when he's crucified and when the Passover begins. So that the chronology is different for John than it is with the Gospels. Now, if you look at John as an outline, we looked at a portion of the introduction and the prologue at the beginning of this class, or in the previous lecture. And if you look at John, there's really two parts of it. There's what's called the Book of Signs and the Book of Glory. And the Book of Signs is basically the narrative of Jesus's life and his performance of 7 different miracles. And then there's dialogue mixed up in there as well. But that's basically Jesus' ministry is in the first 11 chapters. In chapter 12, everything slows down, and Jesus begins his conversation with the disciples at the Last Supper, and you have these farewell scenes that go several chapters, right? And he keeps getting up to go, but then he sits back down and keeps talking, and there's this long, long farewell speech that he gives to the disciples. If you have a red letter Bible that has Jesus' words in red, basically from chapter 12 onward, you got Jesus read up until the crucifixion, starting in chapter 19, 20, somewhere in there. And then you have this epilogue in chapter 21, which scholars believe probably was written last and seems to be dated at the very end of the gospel. So you have basically these 4 parts to the Gospel of John. Let's talk briefly through each one of them. Spoke already a little bit about the intro and the prologue, so let's talk about the Book of Signs. There's 7 earthly signs, and what scholars believe is that Jesus was, or that the author of the Gospel was writing with a sense, with a source, what's called the sign source. And 7 is a great, biblical number, right? And so there's 7 really prominent sources that Jesus does, and some of them, like turning the water into wine, which is the first sign that Jesus does in John, is the only in John. The healing of an official son, well, that parallels some of Luke and Mark. Healing a crippled man, well, he does heal folks in different places. The feeding of the 5,000, we've got that also in the Synoptics, walking on water as well. Restoring sight of blind man, well, chapter 9, well, that blind Bartimaeus. And then only in chapter 11 of John do we have the account of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. But notice how each of these sources or these signs gets to be more and more sort of prominent, right? Or, water into wine, that's a big deal, but then healings and feedings and walking on water and restoring sight and then raising someone from the dead, that's huge, right? So as you go along, the signs become more powerful, and each one is recognized as a sign that Jesus is indeed who he says he is, that he is from the Father, right? You've got this dualism, and each one of these is also an enactment of God's power in the world, right? Part of what John is engaging in is the sense that Christ becomes enfleshed in the world. There's this idea of the incarnation, what scholars call the incarnation. Christ puts on the flesh of humanity, and he imbibes that flesh with power, or endows that flesh with power through these signs. And in fact, his resurrection, his crucifixion and resurrection demonstrate that even our mortal flesh that we can be part of this experience of God's community, right? So the dualism, again, it's that the light is coming into the darkness. There are still those who reject it, but the darkness could not overcome the light, right? And so this word becoming flesh, he's not saying that we can separate ourselves out from our flesh. That's Gnosticism, right? The idea that, oh, my spirit is better than the flesh and I don't need the flesh. No, I think what the vision is in John is that God is reconciling and redeeming the world. The world hasn't recognized it yet, but he's in the process of that redemption of the world, and the world is going to be transformed through this end-time eschatology, and it's begun already through the resurrection. You also have some other important events, like I said, the cleansing of the temple, the dialogue with Nicodemus, the conversion of the Samaritan woman. All of these are great stories in John that we don't have. Well, we have the cleansing of the temple in the Synoptics. But Nicodemus and the Samaritan woman, great stories here in John. Now, we also have the Book of Glory. Now, this may be based on an earlier primitive passion narrative. John does have some similar elements to the Synoptics. But he really dwells on Jesus' conversation during the Last Supper, what I call here the fact that he's leaving soon, his warning of an impending departure. He really does dwell on that here in the end. John's passion story is one of triumph, unlike the Synoptics. I talked about that already. And again, the Last Supper is really given as a foot washing instead of the words of institution. The important thing is that the disciples wash one another's feet, and Jesus washes their feet, right? Right. The idea he becomes the servant leader. Says, if you're going to do this as I'm doing to you, then you need to do for leadership becomes transformed. Instead of being powerful, Jesus bends down as the slave to wash others' feet. He's giving us the example of how we ought to treat one another. The extensive farewell discourses in chapters 13 through 18 and the great high priestly prayer, they really do mark John's gospel as distinctive and unique. And there's a lot of theology, a lot of incarnational theology in those chapters. Like I was talking about, Jesus becomes flesh in the world, and if you accept Christ, then you accept the Father, you become known, and you get to know who Christ is and who God is, okay? The other really cool thing about John is that he talks about how he's going to send the Paraclete. And in a way, we have this sense of the Paraclete being present with the community already. The Holy Spirit is already serving them, and they are already part of that. At least the audience, we get the sense that whoever was writing this had the sense that the audience was already being accompanied by the Holy Spirit, and in a sense they were already a little outpost of eternity in this world. Because of the incarnation, God had already come to the world and was with them in their community. Now, again, I talked about the difference in interpretation between John and the gospel, the Synoptic Gospels, with regard to the Passion. John doesn't suffer in Gethsemane. Jesus does not suffer in Gethsemane. He does not seem to have any agony whatsoever, and this reflects the author's high Christology. Right? And there's a symbolic aspect of this. The water, the piercing of the side, the water and the blood that's pouring out, that sort of relates to almost an ecclesial function of the Holy Supper, the Last Supper, right? The ordinance of the sharing together in communion. And Jesus is in full control throughout. There's no one to carry his cross for him in John. He carries his cross all the way. It's clear in his trial before Pilate that he is, Jesus is innocent, and Pilate goes back and forth. He really doesn't, he can't find anything on Jesus, right? And in a way, the gospel writer is doing this in order to blame not the Romans, but the Jews. And then at the Passion story, there's this formation of community. Mary, the disciple whom Jesus loved, are standing together under the cross. Right? They're not afraid. They're there with him at the end, and he's creating this community. All of this sort of demonstrates that John's passion is really kind of different in terms of what he knew about what Jesus did than the synoptics. One other thing about historical context, and you're going to be working a little bit on John 9. There's a portion where you're going to be looking at this where the man who was blind, who was born blind, his parents are brought forth and interrogated by the Jewish authorities here. And they're afraid to recognize that the man who was born blind is their son because they're afraid they're going to be kicked out of the Jews. Now, kicked out of the synagogue by the Jews, right? And they won't be able to participate in their community anymore. Now, I think that's really very interesting. And scholars have pointed to what they think of as a two-level stage. That what's going on in John's gospel is not reflective necessarily of conflicts in the first century. Think about it. What ethnic group was Jesus? He was a Jew. So why would the parents be afraid of the Jews for their son associating with Jesus, who was a Jew? It makes no sense. It's almost as if the narrative, as if there is something weird about this narrative, something ahistorical, something that does not fit into the historical context. It's like a Wild West or a Western in which aliens suddenly, okay, I know the Wild West did that movie, but anyway, the sense in which you're in a Western and suddenly aliens appear and they're shooting off their laser guns, it doesn't make any sense. It's an anachronism. Jesus was a Jew. Everyone was a Jew. The parents were a Jew. The blind man was a Jew. Everyone in Palestine at that point who was worshiping and working in the synagogue, Jesus' disciples, all of them were Jews. The split occurs later between those who continue to maintain their adherence to the Torah and those who are beginning to adhere to Christ and Christ's interpretation in the Old Testament. And so I think what we've got in John is, like in Matthew, a historical situation sometime around 80 or 90 in which you've got an early Christian group that has now already begun to be excluded from the synagogues. That the Jews now are saying, you're not of us anymore. You've gone off. You've started worshiping this Christ as your Messiah. He's not our Messiah. He's not the Messiah. We're still waiting for the Messiah. This guy's the wrong one. And there's conflict between John's community and conflict with some other Jewish group or some other group that has its roots in Judaism, and that group really has claimed their Judaism as their name. In John's community, Christian is still not used. That word is still not being used in John. So they haven't figured out that term for themselves. In the synoptics, it's clear that the authors talked about Jesus being part of the way, believers maybe, but they haven't really landed on the term Christians yet, right? And we in the Jewish synagogue, they're called Nazarenes, interestingly enough. And there is this thing that's called the Birkat HaManim, which is a benediction, actually, as part of the synagogue worship service. But you have to say this thing, and you have to say it aloud. You say the Nazarenes will be cursed forever, right, and excluded from salvation. People had to say that as part of the synagogue worship, as part of this benediction that they had to say during worship together in the synagogue. Well, if you're a Nazarene, if you're part of this group that is following Jesus, the Nazarene, if you're that person, you can't say that. And so we do have historical evidence from these prayers that were said in Palestinian synagogues between 80 and 90. We have to document the Birkat HaManim. We have the document written up. it's clear that Christians, or that the group of folks who worshiped Christ at that time, that we would call Christians today, they were being excluded from this Palestinian synagogues. So what we've got in this story in John 9, this conflict between Jesus and the Jews, between the parents of the blind man and the Jewish Palestinian authorities, is one that probably mirrors more the reality of 80 or 90 rather than of 20 or 30 when Jesus was living. So you've got this two-level stage. The narrative conflict reflects the later historical period, even though it's supposedly set back during the period of life in which Jesus was living. Why is that important? Well, I talked earlier about the dualism and the ethical dualism in John. If we have this historical understanding, we say, well, that's probably not how it played between Jesus and the authorities. He probably didn't call them the Jews. Right? We realize that John's got a conflict that Jesus didn't have. We don't have to buy into... I mean, Jesus may have had a conflict with the authorities. It clearly did. But not in the same way that John, where they're already calling names. Right? So whoever's writing this gospel, they've got a very dualistic view of the world. They've already excluded the Jews. Well, what about Jesus? If you're going to exclude all the Jews, what happens to your Lord? You can't do that. So we don't have to take this on. Theologically, we can proclaim that Christ is the way to salvation. We can even proclaim that Christ is the only way to salvation, as John clearly says. But we don't have to say that the Jews are villains, that they're enemies, right? We don't have to do this with Islam. We don't have to do this with any other religion. Historically, we can step back and say, okay, these are the issues, these are the conflicts of the text, of the community that wrote the text, the community that originally received the text. We can still understand who Christ is through this text, but theologically we can think a little bit differently about what this text might mean for our communities today, in particular because we have been through a terrible, terrible century or two of religious conflict. Think about what happened to the 6 million Jews during the Holocaust. Think about the terrible conflicts now between Judaism and Christianity and Islam. These don't have to be our conflicts because of our religious texts. I know some of you have been struggling with the historical approach and the scholarly approach, especially those of you who have grown up in the church and have a theological perspective, and you really love these scriptures, and I love them too. I do. But as a theologian, I believe God gave us minds. God gave us brains. And when we're at a university and we're studying a class, I think using our brains in this way, critically thinking through the text, analyzing it, understanding it as a piece of, as literature, as theology, as history, being able to step back and say, yeah, the text has that perspective. And that might have been the perspective of the original audience. That might have been the perspective of the original author. That doesn't have to be mine. I can think through this text. I can pray through this text. I can critically analyze this text in a very serious manner and not share its predilections, its conflicts. That's why I'm in biblical scholarship. It really is. The first New Testament class that I had was liberation for me. And it was really historical, and it was really just deconstructing everything in my faith. And my professor, he was a lovely man, but he really was going after it. But it freed me. And I realized some of the things that I had learned or some of the things that I believed that were unhealthy, that were terrible, didn't have to be. Didn't have to be if I could critically step back, think through, analyze, and also believe that this text was written even for me, a 21st century human being. I hope that gives you something to think about. Thanks for struggling through such a long lecture. I hope you had a chance to pause it maybe a little bit every once in a while, but hope this was worthy for you. Thank you. Bye-bye.